Let me introduce myself. I am from the Philippines. We are two Filipinos here. I'm a partner of the law firm Romulo Mabanta, Buenaventura Syke in Los Angeles. I head the litigation department, and I am also a professor of law. I teach procedure in the local universities. Okay, so I will hand now the floor to Mark.
Thank you. So just by way of introduction of JCI and myself, I work in the litigation department. I have a global remit, and I concentrate purely on the large infrastructure arbitrations, hence the topic this morning. Given that I've been asked to pad out over the entire session, I don't propose, and I have no slide at the end saying questions and answers, so if anyone wants to interrupt at any time, feel free to put your arm in the air or throw something at me or anything, and let's try and make it a bit more interactive than death by PowerPoint for 40 minutes and then a Q&A. So moving on to international arbitration. It's clear that international arbitration and ADR itself was always positioned as the alternative to avoid the black hole. And it was all, I've seen many speeches in forums like this where they talk about arbitration being a far quicker and a far cheaper alternative than litigation. And I'm here to kind of debunk that myth. There is absolutely no way on earth that I can accept that international arbitration is a cheaper avenue to justice than a litigation. I've got cases which are several hundred million, so it's worthy of investment, but the legal bill for each side is well in excess of $10 million. So it's certainly not a cheap avenue. I would also say it's actually not a quicker avenue either. Invariably, the process of arbitration is dictated by the availability of the arbitrators. If it is a complex arbitration, you will select senior judges from whichever jurisdiction you want to go to. Their diaries are invariably blocked out for 2 to 3 years, and the hearing will be scheduled on account of their availability for what can be as long as a 3-week hearing, and then the timetable will be worked backwards. So although it's not quicker, you will have more certainty because you have a definitive window for the hearing and you can move everything back from there. When I talk about the initial time period for arbitration, what I mean by that, and referring to the earlier presentations, is the merits part of the arbitration. Because the enforcement part of the arbitration can take just as long as the merits hearing. And I live in Dubai. I've enforced arbitration awards in Dubai. I'm currently having the pleasure of numerous arbitrations against the Qatar government in regard to their airport. And one of them has a hearing scheduled for 3 weeks' time. We will get the award in about 6 months. I expect there to be another 2 years before we can get that enforced. So it isn't a quick process, and it certainly isn't a cheap process. However, having said all of that, and given that this is a law forum and most of the people in the room are lawyers, I thought it was only appropriate to quote one judge who's certainly more learned than me. In 1913, Lord Morton quoted, and it's on the slide, that no one who has any experience of contracts under which great engineering works, for instance, have been carried out in the last half century, can doubt that no well-advised corporation would have accepted the offer of a contractor to carry out the work for which it desired to execute without having an arbitration clause in the contract. So I've just started this presentation with kind of the proposition that it isn't quicker, certainly isn't cheaper, but I stand by the 1913 quote and think that that remains true today. And the reason for that is, having said that it isn't about speed and it's not about getting a speedy trial, the real question about where you would want it is where you need to have certainty over the competency of the people who are defining and deciding your dispute. So it really is a situation where if you have a high value or a complicated issue, I would advocate that arbitration and international arbitration is the only way forward. When I talk about no technical judicial alternatives, what I mean by that is in certain jurisdictions like the UK, and I'm obviously, as you can tell by my Dorset tones, I'm an English lawyer, the technology and construction court in the UK is certainly somewhere where I would lean to first off. But in the Middle East and in the region where most of my portfolio is at the moment, There is no alternative, and certainly there is no way I would want to try and deal with a dispute for hundreds of millions of dollars over a complicated construction matter using the local courts in Qatar or the local courts in the UAE, where invariably the judiciary, with all of their benefits, do not have any technical understanding of forensic delay analysis as an example, or any real understanding about forensic accountancy. And they would then have court-appointed experts, which in my experience, and I mean this no disrespect to the nationalities, invariably come from Egypt or Sudan or somewhere like that because of the ties with the UAE. And the decision is really based on that expert report. The hearings that I'm dealing with right now have over 2,000 pages of forensic delay analysis reports, and the testimony of these forensic delay analysis go on for 3 or 4 days. That's a type of scrutiny that I would want to have in the hearing. So it really is down to where they're complicated matters. Construction and IP being the best examples is where I see that international arbitration has its place. There are some other benefits to international arbitration as well. The main one being, and I will go into disclosure and everything else over the course of this talk, but there is a dramatically reduced disclosure process, and that can have real benefits in that there are IBA rules in other such situations, but the power to force disclosure in an arbitration is far, far less than in a litigation under most developed jurisdictions. There's also far greater confidentiality. I'm skeptical about how confidential awards really are and how confidential hearings are, but certainly they're not published. In the Middle East, the court system in itself isn't published either, but you can certainly, in Western jurisdictions, avoid far greater publicity by going into an arbitration type situation. And one of the examples that has been relatively recent is the Nokia Apple disputes that went on. For me, that was a sort of dispute that was ripe for an arbitration setting, so you wouldn't get involved in disclosing and publicly talking about various elements of source code and everything else. That was actually heard in the High Court, but I think that type of dispute is what arbitration is made for. And the other part where arbitration, I think, has its place is it's seen as less contentious. So invariably, if you're in an industry where suing your customer, or if you're the customer suing your supplier, kind of can seem to end your business relationship, arbitration is seen as less contentious. In my experience, there's life after arbitration that doesn't always exist after litigation. So having kind of introduced international arbitration, what I'm looking to do over the next, hopefully half an hour, and like I say, jump in at any point, is just touch through the various strands of international arbitration and talk about kind of what the issues are and where I see the best practice. The first one of these is dispute resolution clauses. Now, I fully recognise as a litigator and a dispute lawyer, I come in after the sales team, and I have a transactional team within JCI who negotiate the contracts and deal with it. And they invariably spend their life working with salesmen, and salesmen always have the view that the world is great and everyone will get on fantastic. So dispute resolution clauses are a difficult entity to negotiate in the sales phase of a relationship. Nobody wants to talk about what is going to happen if things go wrong. But they, in my experience, they really do need to be taken seriously. And corporations should ignore them at their peril, because there's been situations where there has been no real understanding of what's going to happen if the wheels fall off the wagon, and so you need to understand. But when you're also looking at them, you need to pay attention to the seat and the law of the contract and the seat of the arbitration. It has some really, really important situations and impacts. And we heard in the earlier talk by, I believe it was Jennifer, who talked about the UAE. And I mean, I live and breathe that in the Middle East. The POA process is very, I would say, archaic, but it's paramount. And I've had situations where I've successfully had awards completely overturned because UK barristers have not had appropriate POAs in place. So from a defensive mechanism, it was fantastic for JCI, but you really do have to understand the legal forum you're working in And that was led by the seat of the arbitration that was given no thought in the sales process. Thankfully, given our understanding of the Middle East market, we knew exactly what was going on, and we laid the groundwork over the course of the arbitration. And when the award came against us that we were not happy with on numerous levels, we had a very easy way of dealing with delaying enforcement. The other part of the seat is there's also huge practical implications in regard to evidence, obviously in regard to enforcement, and procedurally, depending on the law of the contract and the seat of the arbitration, things like professional privilege may or may not exist. And there's situations where we've had arbitrations where my internal advice, granted I appreciate legal privilege is a complicated area in its own right, but my own internal advice has had to make his way into the court bundle and be disclosed, even though it should have been privileged, but under the rules of various jurisdictions, privilege simply isn't recognised or understood. The other part that I've seen come into more prevalent, and I think this is more in an emerging market situation. I don't see it so much in Western jurisdictions, is what I call the layered contractual dispute process. So this is one where, first of all, the CEOs of the corporations would meet on an informal and best endeavours basis, then we would mediate, then only then can we go into arbitration or litigation. I think I understand kind of the good intent behind that, and it's to kind of make sure you explore every avenue before you get into litigation, but for me they don't work. It's you either have a dispute or you don't. If you're mediation for me, and I don't want to step on anyone's toes for any future sessions over the next 2 days, but mediation is either right, the dispute is either right for mediation or it's not. Forcing a mediation invariably won't help. So if you're not going to be able to settle the matter, having a contractual obligation to mediate before you go into arbitration just incurs cost, just incurs longer period of time to be spent before you can get into the actual proper litigation, whether it's arbitration or litigation. And with that time, invariably, people leave the corporation, your witnesses disappear, your evidential flow disappears, and it creates all kinds of problems. So when I'm looking at best practice in regard to dispute resolution clauses, I would suggest it's relatively straightforward. You need to choose a seat which is safe. And in the Middle East, that's not always as easy as it may sound. And I've had limited experience in Africa, but likewise, certain jurisdictions in Africa, I wouldn't necessarily be happy choosing a seat in arbitration in certain areas around Africa. But you also want a legally mature and effective court structure that will then adopt an arbitration award and enable enforcement. And you also should look to limit the stages of your dispute resolution clauses. Once you've gone through the dispute resolution clauses, you then get into the actual dispute itself. And the big split between kind of how an arbitration will be managed is a distinction between whether you have what's known as the pleadings or whether you have memorials. And this really is the split between civil jurisdictions and common law jurisdictions. And obviously I favour the common law jurisdiction being English, and I'm sure most people in the room would prefer the more civil law jurisdiction because that's how they've trained and come into. Memorials are seen to be, and the logic behind them is that they're best to flush out the issues. They should limit spurious claims and getting everything out in the open at the beginning and making sure that all of the evidence, all of the witness statements are issued at the very beginning should make it a far smoother and far cleaner process. Then if you go into a situation where you go through what's commonly known as the pleading, so the common law process, where you start with a very high level statement of case, and over the 2-year period to trial, it develops. Now, there is no right or wrong in this, and it really comes down to that division. But as I put on the slide, I talk about why memorials are seen to be the best way, but I also think they're actually extremely wasteful and create far more cost, because giving everything at the beginning means you can spend an awful lot of time pleading something that the minute you get the defence from the other side or vice versa, it's all accepted. So actually putting all of the detail in at the beginning and spending all that time on expert reports and everything else, you may end up having spent so much time and money on irrelevant matters. And vice versa, you then go through, in effect, 2 complete stages of witness statements, 2 complete stages of expert reports, and you don't actually know what the issue is until the very end, and then you get into all kinds of problems. So from a best practice perspective, I can't give you any kind of advice, I can't give you any wisdom from my side. I don't think there is a best practice. I think it's very case specific, and I think you, in my experience, you have very limited means of actually judging which way it will go. It will invariably be the decision of the tribunal, it will invariably be the decision of the chairman of the tribunal, and if you go for a civil jurisdiction chairman or chair lady, you'll have memorials. If you have a common law makeup, whether that's America or Asia or the UK, you may well have the more pleading perspective. But it really is a horses for courses, and you have to deal with however it comes through. Moving on to disclosure. Generally, in international arbitration, it's under the IBA rules. And as I said in kind of my introduction, it's a far more limited process than in Western mature jurisdictions through litigation, where you have real kind of subpoena rights and everything else. The big issue with arbitration that I've seen is that the disclosure process is limited and decisions are made on de facto arguments and merits. And it's for no more practical reason, in my experience, than the tribunal they've been given the case, but they haven't looked into it. They have other cases that are ongoing. It's at least 18 months, if not 2 years, till the main hearing. They're not being paid huge sums of money at this early stage under whichever jurisdictional rules you're dealing with, be it ICC or anything else. So they're not going to want to spend an awful lot of time reading huge submissions in regard to kind of the disclosure perspective. So you really do have to know your arguments in arbitration from the very beginning, and you need to understand your evidential requirements, because cases can turn very quickly on unappealable disclosure rulings that are made, as I say, on very limited grounds where the tribunal are looking at. Having said that, though, the limited disclosure can be a real benefit equally. You can, however questionable it may be, you can easily lose evidence you don't want to disclose. It can be easily done that you know things exist. The other side won't give it to you, and there's very limited ways you can force that to happen. But having said that, when that does happen, under most arbitration rules, and certainly my experience is heavily ICC, the drawing of adverse inferences can be a huge help in the submission phase of the cases. So sometimes you do go on a fishing expedition knowing that they're not going to disclose evidence that may not even exist. But the fact you've asked for it, the fact that it's been granted and then not disclosed, potentially because it isn't in existence, doesn't stop you being able to make some pretty weighty submissions around they've breached the order under disclosure, and you can build some strong arguments to kind of tip the balance in your favour around the whole disclosure perspective. So the limited disclosure can be both a benefit and a curse to the claimant or the defendant, depending on where you sit. So from a best practice perspective, you really do need to know your end game. Because as I say, cases do turn on these non-appealable early disclosures. And the one successful tactic that I will kind of spend a second to talk about, and this is, to put this into perspective, this is in regard to a case. The main hearing of it is, as I say, against the Qatar government in a few weeks' time, but it's to do with the Doha airport. So we were the main contractor, and we had a subcontractor who started an arbitration against us, and we have an arbitration against the government, and we're squeezed in the middle. Now, there was no joinder of arbitration mechanism that we could have, and for various reasons we wouldn't have wanted that anyway. But we had a situation where the subcontractor, knowing that we had passed through an awful lot of their claims up the line to the government, given that it was kind of, we were the conduit in the middle, made this huge fishing expedition and put in place several hundred requests for disclosure, all of them questionable. They started the process going, we exchanged the red fern schedules, and then they dropped absolutely everything. And they said, the only thing that we want, there's enough documentation on record, the only thing that we want is JCI's pleadings against the government of Qatar in the upstream case. Now, normally you would have quite a strong argument to say, it's confidential, it's unrelated and whatever else, albeit it's slightly more complicated because obviously the facts in both cases are very similar. So there were some grounds where they could hold out for legitimate argument. But having kind of dropped everything from this 200-item Redfern schedule, the tribunal jumped at the opportunity to latch onto their request. It was a very easy out for them. They didn't have to deal with anything. They could say, yeah, fine, we'll give you that disclosure. And it put us in all kinds of problems because obviously we're passing up claims against the government where downstream we're talking about, well, you haven't proved this or you haven't proved that. So it was a very successful situation that came, in our opinion, to the detriment of JCI. I can't tell you how it ultimately played out because we're still waiting on the award and we've been waiting for the last 6 months. The actual hearing took place in November. So kind of if I ever give this talk again, I can fill in that gap and tell you how it ultimately played out. But it was one example of kind of if you know your end game and what you want to do, how you can easily build up a relatively successful process of disclosure. The big problem that I see with arbitration, though, is spurious claims and frivolous claims. And this is really because there's a very limited way of getting these claims struck out. Tribunals will not want to make decisions, and tribunal members will not want to make decisions before they have heard all of the evidence. When you make applications, certainly in my experience in the TCC and the High Court, you've got far more ability to get claims struck out early on because they haven't fulfilled the basic evidential burdens. In my experience, tribunals will not want to make that decision until everything is on the record and they have all the evidence. So you do have a situation where you can have some very, very spurious claims that unfortunately, because the other side have such crazy expectations of recovery, they're not going to settle and they're going to have to go the whole way. And only kind of at the end will you be able to get an award against them. And part of the issue with spurious claims is what I call partisan experts still exist. Again, it's, I think, a far greater emerging market situation, but across the Middle East, there are hired guns, as I call them, where if you pay enough money, you can get an independent expert to just about write a report saying anything. And that keeps claims alive and keeps arbitration process going. When you get to the final hearing, hopefully, kind of you can get it overruled. But because of the non-reporting of this, these experts and independent experts, their credibility remains intact because if they were in the High Court, if they were in a public forum where they were reported on, they would soon get a reputation and people would soon understand how bad they actually are and how tribunals or judges have completely ignored their evidence. Whereas in arbitrations, that doesn't exist. So these partisan experts do have a life and carry on working in that way throughout. And the other part is there's no real standard rules of wasted costs. So costs in general in international arbitration and arbitrations in general come under the wide remit of discretion of the tribunal. So they have under the ICC rules kind of say they can take into account anything that they consider necessary. So getting a wasted cost order is far more complicated than if it was following a common law procedure rules in the UK as an example. So again, from a best practice perspective, the reality is that they're unavoidable. I don't think there's any way of getting spurious claims removed. And you've really just got to look at making cost protective offers. I know kind of the UK quarter bank type situation or payments into courts don't exist in arbitration, but you need to build up kind of the flow and say, look, we've tried to get this settled and tried to get this removed in order to then look to get costs back after the event. But as I talk about the airport cases in Doha, we have one matter where we value it somewhere between, we will be the paying party, we value it somewhere between $5 to $15 million. The claim against us is for $280 million, and our legal bill is $13 million. So we spent $13 million defending a case, which we've had to do given the spurious nature of the claim, but we had no alternative, and we're hoping, obviously, when the award comes, we've made appropriate offers and we can say, look, we spent this money, if they took the offer 3 years ago, we wouldn't have spent any of this, and hopefully we can recoup a large part of that. But there is no other way to do it. The other thing that on the final bullet, something that I've seen more and more is contractual clauses which ultimately say if you start a case and you don't recover your full amount of claim, then you are liable to the other side's cost in totality. Now, in many jurisdictions, I don't think they would ever stand up, but certainly in some, and in the Middle East where they talk about under the civil code of UAE and Qatar, where it talks about the contract is the law of the parties, if you've got something like that in place, it's a huge evidential value to say, we saw this coming, we agreed that if you're making these spurious claims and you don't kind of get what you're claiming for, all of our costs are recoverable. Members of the tribunal, you have to follow this because it's a contractual clause that everyone signed up to. So it's worth thinking about, and I just say thinking about these type of clauses because they do have some value, although I do recognise in many jurisdictions they will probably be struck out. Sorry. Yeah, please.
Are you more on the claimant side on average or more on the defence side?
It really is for JCI a 50-50 situation. We have a number of matters where we're a main contractor, where we are kind of, if you like, squeezed in the middle. So we invariably have kind of multiple cases around one project because if the project starts going wrong, it goes wrong for everybody, and there's therefore kind of a huge amount there. So I'm kind of talking with kind of upstream and downstream claimant and defensive eyes on.
One of the things on the claimant side is, I think this is a really interesting clause that you're considering with the cost recovery. And I think it would stand up in many civil law countries because the law on contract is basically, you have to keep up with your contract. So I think that's a really good advice. One of the things we encountered a lot when you're on the claimant side is that the interest, so for instance for non-payment, no doubt that you will have certain installments that are being left unpaid, very often the last installments when your project's more or less finished. If the interest rate is Euribor or Libor plus 1% or so, then the financial incentive on the other side to pay and to is so low because if you just look at it from a CFO's perspective, he can borrow on the capital market. If he borrows on the capital market to pay you, he pays more than what he is paying in terms of interest rate to just wait and see what happens. So default interest works. We just know for a fact that if you have non-payment a clause where you do not pay, let's say, for 2 or 3 months, after that you get a penalty interest that is contractually sound, that it gives an incentive to, let's say, to avoid non-payment. Is that something that you've considered sometimes?
Yeah, without sounding totally like a lawyer, obviously depends on the situation. But the other kind of the extension of that is under the Middle East jurisdictions, there's also unjust enrichment type provisions under the civil code. So in the same way, the flip side of that argument is that in not paying us, they're making money. So therefore, they're unjustly enriching through a mandatory breach of contract. So kind of that's the way that in the Middle East we've done it because interest is a questionable kind of thing in that jurisdiction anyway. So we've had to follow it through that way. In Western jurisdictions, you can normally get aggregated interest in things and build it up that way. So it really depends on the jurisdiction and where you go, but it's certainly a very valid point. The other big situation that I've seen is, given the international arbitration by definition has international parties, there is a completely different culture and what I call different street rules in regard to all of the parties. There is never a standard approach to how people behave. So I'm a barrister, I was called to the English bar, I'm a member of the English Bar and I have a code of conduct that I have to follow. And that means that I've got to be very careful, as an example, before I start making accusations of fraud and start throwing things around. I've had cases against Lebanese companies that are more than happy to allege fraud at every turn. And so there's a situation, and being an American corporation, when our chief litigation officer flies into some of the big cases, she's there going crazy because we're being accused of all kinds of things, and we're being a little bit more refined in how we present and how we argue. And kind of she's used to a very different way and a far more combative advocacy style. And so it really is kind of a need to understand the rules of the street, as I call them, and how we go through, and understand kind of the etiquette of everybody, and ensure that you have an understanding as it goes further in regard to experts and witnesses. I mean, using the American example, in America, kind of witnesses and expert witnesses are coached to an inch of their life. I mean, there is almost no need for them to turn up to give evidence, because the lawyers could just stand up and tell us what they're going to say, because they've invariably implanted it into the witness. Whereas under kind of the UK or England and Wales, there are very firm rules between kind of what you can do, and witness familiarisation is allowed, but there are very fine lines between kind of crossing into the coaching perspective, and that's something that you've got to always bear in mind. The other big one that I've found, as I've kind of had cases across multiple jurisdictions, is causation is something, and legal causation should be a universal concept. And I think it's kind of the first thing that we kind of learn when we're building cases. But in many jurisdictions, people have no idea the difference between correlation and causation. And I've honestly ran defences where I'm talking about the correlation between, and this is actually true, if you go onto Google and you Google pointless correlations, you find all kinds of graphs. And there's a 99.7% correlation between US spending on space and science and the suicide rate. And my all-time favourite, there's a 95% correlation between the consumption of cheese and the death of people who get strangled by their bed sheets. Now, I have no idea how people get killed by their bed sheets, but I have actually used this in defensive arguments, saying that you're not arguing about causation, you're saying that this happened and this happened, and because they look like they happened at the same time, you win your case. That's correlation, that's not causation. And there's been many cases I've had. Again, I find this kind of distinction more in the emerging markets, where with respect to anybody who from kind of those areas, it's a slightly less mature legal system. That understanding of actual what causation isn't as prevalent. So you kind of got to understand who you're dealing with, and likewise you need to be aware of cultural behaviours. And again, I mean no disrespect, and I'm using sweeping generalisations, but if you've got an Indian witness as an example, you've got to be very mindful if the head nodding, and even though they're saying yes, but they shake their head, how will that be perceived by members of the tribunal? So in this international setting, you're going to have international people, and you need to make sure that they understand how things are working. And I know I've already touched on it, but likewise, be aware of the POA perspective. As we heard, there's people get into trouble with that, but if you understand kind of from the offset what the rules are, you can normally get around it. So from a best practice, obviously, be aware and understand the culture. But as important, I think you need to make sure that you have a senior enough tribunal who understand. You need to have senior kind of, in my experience, I would always look to English judges, purely because of my background and knowing how I can build a case around them, but who would then be seasoned enough to see through, using the Lebanese example, of all of these accusations of fraud with no basis, and see through this causation correlation distinction. So on the same vote, and I'm mindful of the time, so I will speed up slightly, from a perspective of advocacy in arbitration, it's fundamentally different to litigation. It's all about what's on the record. And when I've done advocacy myself, and I've instructed barristers and solicitors of various seniority, and the big thing that I've seen when I've gone with more junior people is they don't always know when to stop asking questions. And in arbitration, you can very often ask too much. And if you've got what you need on record and you can make submissions based on that record, in no way, shape or form do you want to give the witness an opportunity to explain it away. And again, with putting in kind of an in-house perspective with my American boss at the Chief Litigation Officer of JCI, with her American advocacy background, she wants to ask everything. And she kind of invariably comes in at the last minute, not having read the thousands and thousands of pages on record, and gets very irate when she's saying, well, why aren't we asking about this? And the simple reality is we have what we need, and we don't want to reduce that and the value of that through asking. Likewise, as I talk about partisan experts, you want to make sure that your own expert doesn't come across like they're advocates for your case, because that's the easiest way to discredit them. They need to be independent. They need to give their view, warts and all, against your case. And you've also got to be very mindful that there is limited time for cross-examination. Arbitration hearings normally have a chess clock. You normally have a set amount of hours you can deal with, and you've got to be selective of who you're going to. If you're in the High Court, the TCC, you could kind of build up cross-examination over, in some situation, days. In arbitration, the most I've ever kind of had with a main witness on the other side is basically a day, so kind of 6 hours of cross. So you need to work in a different way to build up the case. So again, from a best practice perspective, know when to ask questions and when not to, and really think about kind of how the witnesses are going to come across and understand those cultural differences. In the same way as kind of the advocacy, again, from a kind of definition, international arbitration means that language is a live issue. And the simple reality is you need to bear in mind the language of the tribunal when you are deciding that dispute resolution clause, and be aware of all the practicalities of what goes on with that, because it can play a rather crucial situation. Obviously, there's a practicality thinking. If all the documents are in English, you don't want to agree to the language in another language and then have to go through the hassle of translating everything, and then invariably the arguments around not agreeing translations and everything else. But the main part that I kind of talk about from a language perspective is this isn't about my advocacy. I invariably know the limits of what I can and can't do, and look to instruct, hopefully, senior kind of QCs from England to do the advocacy. But I'm yet to see, however good they are that I've instructed, yet to see anyone really get any wins for the case from a translated cross-examination. It invariably becomes kind of people giving speeches and then they get translated. That delay means it is very difficult. So you need to be mindful, if you are going into a situation with translation, of the limits of what you can gain from a hearing using translation.
Sorry, Anderson, you can...
Yeah, please.
No, I was just wondering, what role, if any, do you think interpreters can play on the issue of languages? And forgive me, I'm talking from a litigation background. In court, it's typical to have an interpreter give evidence, interpret in the local language of the witness to the court, to the language of the court. I was wondering if that could be introduced in arbitration, or if you've had those kind of experiences.
So the bulk of my experience with translation is when it comes to Middle Eastern cases where it's under Qatar or UAE law, and we have a Qatari or a UAE law expert. Invariably, they would only want to speak in Arabic about the civil code. So there's a translation through that. And the translator is sat in the periphery. It looks like the UN. You're all sat with headsets and kind of you ask the question, it gets translated. They speak back in Arabic, and then you hear the live translation. So
okay, it speaks to some of the issues that I tried to raise with Wigger in the first session. That sometimes, even in international arbitration, when you are dealing with cultures or countries that probably are not as advanced as the scenario you have painted, you may not have those kinds of UN what do you call them, gadgets or what have you, that easily
Yeah.
translates. You actually have to have somebody do that physically.
Well, I mean, they're invariably sat in the room, and I've had situations where, I mean, thankfully, even the chairman of the tribunal corrected translations coming through, just saying, actually, that's not what was said when they heard it. But I would also say it's a skill to learn how to cross-examine through translation. And using some of the sort of the people on my side, and this isn't kind of saying that we were great and the other side were terrible, although they were terrible, they couldn't deal with it. So they ended up invariably talking in, this one was a Lebanese case and he wanted to speak in French. So they started asking the questions in French because the witness, the expert witness, couldn't get out what he wanted. So invariably it fell apart and the wheels came off the other side because it showed that they'd coached and everything else. So you've got to, if you're going to have to use translations, and fully appreciate in some jurisdictions it's less developed than kind of the headsets or whatever else, but even if there's somebody just stood in the room kind of repeating it, there's a certain skill that I think isn't straightforward, and you need to have somebody who has experienced using that to get the evidence out, because it's, in my experience, it's far more difficult. And I'm yet to, as I say, have any wins through any testimony that's been given through translation. And that kind of brings my last point. It can also be a defensive mechanism. So I think the other side in the cases, we haven't used it as a defensive tactic, but I think the other side against me often has. And they've got expert reports on local law. They've invariably chose to want to speak in French or want to speak in Arabic. And they've used that to try and make the report stand up, knowing that the translation can kind of be a defensive cloak and you'll be very limited on how you'll be able to discredit them. And so the minute that they were asking for translation, we immediately knew that we need to make sure we attack this on the documentation as opposed to expecting anything to be brought out in the actual hearing. So final kind of point from an arbitration perspective, which is a relatively new one, and that's the use of modern IT solutions and kind of the documentation bundles that kind of go through. And going back to kind of the introductory premise about I would only ever advocate international arbitration for these complicated matters, invariably complicated matters tend to have far more documentation in existence. So in my experience, kind of the cases that I've been dealing with over the last 2 and 3 years, the bundles have been 500-600 leather arch files of documentation. They've been phenomenal. So if we had to pull together cross-examination bundles with copies for all of the panelists, for the witness, for the advocates, it would have been a nightmare. So we've looked to use IT solutions, and Opus Magnum is one that I will talk about because it's, in my opinion, one of the best. But it makes it far easier to be able to deal with. It's also easier to manage upstairs, and for anyone who works in house, kind of your client being the business is kind of who you've got to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but you invariably have people who sit behind bigger desks than you in the corporate structure, and managing upstairs is as difficult and as important for a corporation as managing the client. So if you've got kind of the IT solutions where they can get access and just see the level of documentation and read some reports and everything else, in my appearance, it does actually help. It's not necessarily cheap. I think you can get a certainty around the cost, and I would say there's definite a benefit through the hearing where you've got everything on an IT platform and you can call up the documents quickly as you're going through that process. So I do think these IT systems are beneficial. And there's another quote there that just talks about, as I say, Opus Magnum, which is the platform that I would prefer to use. And for big cases, you're talking around $100,000 cost. So it is an investment to be done. But I think it was an investment worthwhile given the magnitude of documentation, and it just makes the whole process a lot smoother, a lot easier. The hearing goes a lot simpler. There's no panic of pulling bundles together and everything else kind of overnight in war rooms as we used to do in the past. So IT is here. Life is kind of evolving into a more IT savvy situation, and I think people really should look to to embrace it. It's not cheap. Invariably, there are license fees, but the earlier you kind of invest into this in your hearing, that the easier it comes. In there's situations where you can hyperlink your witness statement, so kind of you can refer to the annexes and everything else far quicker, and it makes your submissions far easier to write. So I would certainly say in big complicated matters, you should really look and investigate IT systems to see how they help. So from a conclusion perspective, I started with the premise that arbitration isn't cheaper and it certainly isn't quicker. But as I say, it really does have its place. A judicially competent technical court would always be my preference. I would always, if I could, look to go to the TCC or equivalent. I certainly would never look to litigate a complicated matter in a Middle East court. I think I've had better experience of them than some of my colleagues in the earlier speeches, and kind of I see the Middle East court system is invariably you wait till it gets to the Court of Causation anyway. So you'll always get some perverse first instance and appeal jurisdictions, but the Court of Causation tends to get it right in the Middle East. But on these complicated matters, you would want some say over who's going to be dealing with your case. You've always got to be conscious of enforcement. It is always a nightmare, but it's also something that, going back to the first question, kind of sitting here being a claimant and a defendant, I'm looking forward to tying up one award that will come in due course in Middle East enforcement action for 2 years, and I bet whether it's morally right or not, it will be our strategy where we will object to enforcement, and we would then look to have a commercial discussion depending on how the award came out. And as you kind of talking about the interest rates, given that the money's with us, we will tie it up in enforcement and say, look, we can settle for less than the award, you can get your money now. And that type of thing has its merits from a defensive perspective. So you've always got to be aware of enforcement. But the ultimate situation or conclusion, I would say, is it is an expensive option, but it's one that you have more control over your justice than I think normal litigation, particularly in emerging markets. And it absolutely has its place. And when conducted correctly, in my opinion, it's by far the better option than litigation certainly in emerging markets. And so that really concludes kind of everything I'd like to say on the matter.
There's a question there from our friend.
I have a comment, actually. As you may know, there is some jurisdictions in the Middle East that cannot allow you to award a maximum amount of fees paid by the parties. There is a ceiling for that fees. In some jurisdictions, it's a minimum amount of fees. So assume that you are in an arbitration case and both parties paid legal fees, and the arbitral tribunal want to award one of the parties the fees. There is a ceiling for such fees, but if the tribunal award the amount of fees paid by the parties according to the percentage of success, this award might be annulled by the local courts or might be adjusted to be in accordance with the local laws. So the concept of that the law is the contract is the law of the contractors, provided that the contract does not contravene with the local laws. I always have a question in this regard. Assume that the arbitral tribunal issue an award, and part of the award was annulled by the local courts. Part. I'm not saying the whole award. Does that mean that the award issued by the local courts is a court decision or arbitral decision? My question, because does it go under the New York Convention or does it go under the enforcement of foreign laws, since the local courts annul part of the award? It's not anymore the arbitration award. So these are two questions and needs your comments, please.
So in my experience in the Middle East, and I'm not sure which particular jurisdiction you're talking to, the fees and recovery of fees is for litigation. And I've never had a situation where a award is contested on the basis that the fees element of that award crosses any threshold. You're absolutely right from if in the local court system, certainly in across the GCC, which I've had experience with, costs don't follow the event. So you're never going to really get anything other than de minimis fees back. But in arbitration, I've never had that situation where there's been a contesting of the fees element of the award as contradiction of any civil code. So I kind of can answer I'll let you come back to you in due course. The other thing that I would say, though, is in my experience, arbitration awards tend to be final awards including costs consideration. So you will have your cost submissions that you make. You won't pass them to the arbitration panel until they've decided the merits element and the liability element, and then they will consider the cost component and tie that into the award. And whether it's the right way or not, and whether it's correct or not, it's not for me to say, but in my experience, certainly arbitration panels, and I'm dealing with kind of the panels that kind of I'm in front of are normally very senior kind of judges as well. So they're experienced lawyers. They find the decision that they want to give, and then they work out the way of giving the decision. So they kind of reverse engineer the award. So they know what they're going to give and then write the award to give it. So if there are costs issues, they would be lost in kind of the liability piece. So I've never had that issue that you talk about, and I've also never had it quite as clear as in the arbitration award, where you could, if we wanted to contest the fees element of it, because it all gets wrapped up together. So I know I'm not really answering your question, but
if you allow me to comment, because I'm only aware of our local laws jurisdiction, which put the ceiling for the legal fees that can be awarded by one party to the other party. So if the fees are exceeding this limit, this is against the local laws regulations. So would that be a reason for annulment or not? This is another question. But there is a challenge in some arbitration cases under the local laws that the awarded amount exceeding the limits under the local laws, which make the decision against the public order. But on the assumption that this may fly, on the assumption, and the court annul part of the decision based on that argument, would it make it a court decision or arbitral decision? So I can take it under New York Convention to enforce or against foreign law.
Sorry, do you want to add a comment? Or I'll hand it over, because I was almost going to open up to the floor anyway, because in my experience, it's unusual for part of an award to be annulled and not enforced. It's either fully enforced or it's not enforced. So I've not had an experience where part of awards is struck out and the remaining exist. It's either all in or all out. And I would just add one comment about the Middle East. I think it gets quite a bad press from the court system. Enforcement issues historically did exist, and you've got some very perverse situations where courts, for nominal reasons, look to not enforce arbitration awards. Qatar, as an example, issued a new arbitration law earlier this year. The Middle East in general, Qatar and the UAE are looking to establish themselves as business hubs, and they need the arbitration system to work in order to enable it to kind of go through. So if the local court started to overturn awards and not enforce them, the whole system would fall apart. So it does happen. I do think it gets exaggerated the extent that it happens, but that's my experience. I know if I was sat here on the other end of some arbitration awards, having spent millions and millions of legal fees, and then a local court overturns it or doesn't enforce it on a technicality, I may have a different view. But it's unusual in my experience to really get an award. Now, I mean, 20 years ago, it's a different matter. But I think enforcement in the Middle East is far less of an issue. I think in my far more limited experience in Africa, it's far more difficult not to enforce the award, to action the payment on the back of an enforced award. But that's something very different than actually getting the court to enforce the award. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah. Uh, I think it's in the Middle East where you're talking about, let's say, the UAE, Qatar, it is two steps forward and a step back again. In Dubai, you have the DIFC, which has a notably reliable arbitration system. But then the local Dubai courts can overturn cases. And they actually recently enacted a decree, Decree 19, where there is a judicial committee that can actually judge whether or not to enforce in the Dubai area one from the DIFC, the free zone, or not. And the composition of the judicial committee is in favor of the local courts. So you've had a few very awkward decisions in Dubai that is actually going against the development that I think you described correctly as being more beneficial to arbitration. I think if they really want to have foreign direct investment continue in that area, there's no way around it. You have to have a professional, reliable court system. But it is sometimes also, taking peculiar action. You're coming to your question. I do not see the relevance, but maybe I'm missing a point. If you have an arbitration award and you seek recognition in your country, then what you're basically doing, at least under the New York Convention, but also under ICSID, well, ICSID, it is just more easy, but the reality is that you turn it around into a local judgment. What you're basically saying is that recognition procedure here in this country goes only so far as its public order allows it. In other words, in that jurisdiction where those assets, where it needs to be enforceable, it doesn't get any better than in accordance with what you just said, that with the maximum, but it continues always to be a local judgment. You transform an arbitration award in a local judgment, only then a local bailiff can knock on the debtor's door to get actual payment. So then the question of whether that end result can still be called an arbitration so becomes a bit of a moot point. The end result is always a court decision. Outside of your jurisdiction, nobody's going to look at Jordan, local courts, about the status of that. They will have their own court system judging whether or not they will turn it into a local judgment, and then we call that enforcement. That's I think,
I don't want to take others' time, but just one comment. Arbitral award was issued in Jordan, and the local courts in Jordan annul the arbitral decision due to some difficulties in the decision or mistakes in the decisions due to that the decision was against public order in Jordan. So the local courts annulled this decision. But when this decision was taken to France, French courts decided to enforce this arbitral decision, although the local courts in Jordan decided to annul the decision. But the question was, I don't know if there is other jurisdiction that allow the courts annul part of the decision. I'm not sure.
what is the seat
In
of the
Philippines,
arbitration?
maybe. In Philippines,
The Philippines.
allow the court to annul part of the decision and accept the remaining part. Assume that
But that only is relevant if the seat of arbitration is in the Philippines or in Jordan.
Yeah, definitely.
Otherwise,
Definitely.
each country
Yes,
is on its own.
definitely. If the tribunal decide to award parts that were not including in the arbitration clause, so the court
Let me
may
share.
annul. Yeah.
Let me share, Ian. Let me share. This might be something unusual for the rest of you. I've received a number of query, one from Ireland, one from UK, one from India in connection with constructions in the Philippines. It is very peculiar in the sense that it has been carved out by Philippine law, such that even if you stipulate that there is a seat of arbitration, let's say in Singapore, or let's say in New York, by provision of law, automatically the Philippines is a seat of arbitration. So the very moment, it's unusual, the very moment, okay, so even if we agree, contractually agree, that it will be New York, but if for one reason I'm crazy to change my mind and say, I want it in the Philippines, I file it in the Philippines, that excludes the seat of arbitration. And then that's just one example. And then let's say it's the local construction arbitration that hears it and renders an arbitral award. These are the questions that I receive. You could appeal it. It's actually appealed. From that construction arbitration, it goes, that's why I understand where you're coming from, it goes to the regular court on a full review of the facts and the law. Not only on the matter, let's say, of the international conventions against public policy and the like. The justices could reopen it, we've seen that. And then it goes up to the last court, the Supreme Court, and you'll be surprised sometimes that it's a different decision after all. So it's a peculiarity of, let's say, our system. Although we recognize international arbitration for as long as there's an international component, we recognize that. It's actually three parts: international, domestic, and construction is actually being carved out. So to some, it's crazy. So that's why I'm sharing this with you. To some of you have construction issues in the Philippines. Be very careful on stipulating. It doesn't mean that if you stipulate, you go to that seat of arbitration. Thank you.
That's good to know. I have a question. If you look at Johnson Controls, it is sometimes a claimant and sometimes a defendant in these large projects. How do you deal with costs? A lot of companies are now managing their legal department as a profit center. Actually, Michelin, for instance, does that. Deutsche Bahn. We know that GE undertakes measures to basically let portfolio of claims be funded. Is that something that is in your firm?
My colleague is talking on, I think, session 4, who is the EMEA litigation director. He's probably the right person to answer that question, because I am an anomaly within JCI in that I report into the litigation head and dotted line straight into the board. So I get budgets for these big cases and run off. I'm also, we'll talk offline, I'm also kind of looking at litigation funding type mechanisms for these bigger one-off type situations. On the day-to-day kind of litigation, and I don't mean to in any way underplay my colleague's role in his team, the general litigation department is a cost center. Well, the legal department's a cost center, and we're looking invariably to save costs at every turn. I'm kind of the joke of the company and the legal team in that my spend is dramatically more than anything else. I mean, we have travel bans and all the usual stuff that that corporations have. However, I'm still flying all over the place and kind of get away with murder and can still expense everything and whatever. So I'm probably the wrong person to answer your question. But Frederick, who will be here and talking about how corporations fund it, will tell you, but I will choose to ignore what he says because I will carry on running Maverick in the way that I am. But the short answer is, yeah, I mean, it's obviously at every turn corporations are looking to save costs. But when we've got cases such as the one on the Doha airport where we're being sued for over $200 million in a case we think that the entitlement is only kind of 10 million, and our view of what we can recover from the Qatar government for the entirety of the contract, not just the subcontractors piece, is about 40 million. When we've got a case for 200 million against us, we're going to spend money to save it. So in that regard, kind of there are different conversations to be had.
That's on the defence side.
But that, I mean, that's one of the situations where we're the claimant and the defendant on the same factual annex and we're in between. So, I mean, it's that kind of thing. So I only really deal with I want to say the big juicy stuff, but I mean, that might glamorise it a bit too much, but it's a particular situation. Is there another
There's a comment
question
there.
at the end?
Question.
I'm mindful of the time.
Yes, we're still okay.
Are we still okay?
Anyway, just wanted to get the experience of the group. Has anybody here encountered a situation where about the interplay between arbitration and insolvency law? Because there is a provision to the effect that if an arbitration is pending, all civil proceedings against the party against whom the arbitration case filed should be suspended. At the same time, there's also a provision in insolvency law that once a reorganization proceeding is commenced, all proceedings are stayed. So there seems to be two contradictory provisions. Have you encountered this situation before?
I've only no. I mean, I can give you my view, but I've not actually physically lived that situation. I don't know if anyone has and can speak more widely. I mean, obviously, in my experience, the minute that we start suing somebody and they're looking to go insolvent,
And
you're going to feel better because you get an award, but it's going to be meaningless. So you're just throwing good money after bad. So, I mean, you just kind of run away immediately. And the reason why it exists is because the ICC or whatever the tribunal is are also they're a commercial body. So they don't want to have bad debt. So if they know that one of the parties to the arbitration is looking to go insolvent, they're a payment risk. So that's why they're going to say, kind of everything stayed and we're not incurring any costs because we don't think we've got a legitimate risk of being paid. So I've not lived that situation. I don't know if anyone has, but the minute that I've got any case, arbitration or otherwise, and there's a legitimate chance of people going insolvent, I wouldn't even start the matter. And then I would have a very different conversation with the business saying that you might as well write it off. We might spend 2 years and have a moral victory, but it's meaningless and we're here to make money, so let's not throw good money after bad.
Yeah, because there is a contrary view that it's important to pursue the arbitration proceeding so that the arbitral award may be paid as part of the claim during liquidation proceedings.
Yeah. Fine, but you get an award for 100, but they've got millions and millions of losses. Your award of 100 is only worth kind of 1% or whatever. So, I mean, my advice to if I was managing that situation would be just that there's absolutely no point.
Just forget the claim.
That's kind of Mark Kelly's view. I don't know if anyone else has but I mean, you're throwing good money after bad. So what the hell's the point is my personal view. But
yeah, because it can be. Yeah, that's why I was saying reorganization or rehabilitation, because there may be a white knight coming in to save the company, and the arbitral award may be paid as part of that of the estate. Yeah.
yeah, fair point. I mean, I'm giving you my view. I mean, I realise it's factually dependent and everything else, but I certainly wouldn't waste my time personally. But I mean, if my boss has told me to carry on, I would carry on because they pay my salary. But I certainly wouldn't be advocating doing it. But there would be situations where you might have to for whatever reason. I've had situations where I've bankrupted parts of companies because we were being sued for similar reasons and we had protection around it. So it's just like, well, fine, we were happy enough to just let it ride off as a kind of a litigation shield. So kind of I've lived the other side, but I wouldn't chase an insolvent company.
Yeah, Mark, believe me, you're not an anomaly, contrary to your earlier comments. I just want to make a quick comment, and that is to reference the statement you made about certain jurisdictions, some of the challenges you may face in certain jurisdictions with conducting arbitration proceedings and enforcing awards. And I think, again, I'll probably go back to Wigger's comments that in some jurisdictions it's 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. As I said earlier, we've recently taken steps in my own jurisdiction to, and this is coming from the Chief Justice of Nigeria, to all head of courts, mandating that arbitration clauses in commercial contracts must be enforced, must be recognized. Typically, you have, as litigators, tendency to rush to court, notwithstanding clear provisions that there is a contract within a contract that mandates parties to explore those means of resolution. And it's only when you are in court that you find your opponent raising it as an objection and what have you. And the courts, for a long time, have been at sea in most of the states in my country where they except you raise that point, they don't look at it, and they allow trial continue till a decision is given. So with this new direction, there's a clear mandate to the courts that the moment you cite, you don't have to wait for the lawyer to refer to it, but the moment you cite an arbitration clause, you must ensure that parties explore.
Arbitration.
Yes.
I think we have a similar jurisprudence, not a law, jurisprudence in our country.
In your country, yes.
We have to go through it. Yes.
Exactly. You must go through, and where you fail to, significant cost is imposed on the party that
I
has
think that's
ignored
very
that.
common
Yeah.
from emerging markets.
As I understand, and correct me, because obviously it's your jurisdiction, the law is that you have to contest the court's jurisdiction at the first
Yes,
available
before any step
hearing.
is taken, exactly.
So if you don't contest it on, in effect, day one in court,
Yes.
you then lose the right to
Yes.
argue. That, and as I understand it, that was taken from the Kenyan situation where similarly. So it's a very standard
Yes.
situation. And I guess my comment would only be, with everything, it's to do, you've got to make sure you do your due diligence properly. And
Yes.
I'm not picking on the example about the UAE
Yes.
and whatever
Yes.
else, but I think if you do your due diligence on the jurisdiction, you will know that precedents don't exist, and even if it did exist in the UAE, the system doesn't follow them anyway. So kind of, if you're suing in the Middle East, you have to appeal the jurisdiction of the court in the first hearing to say it's an arbitration provision. I think that's a relatively universal provision, and if you do your due diligence properly, which obviously involves checking the contract and whatever else, you will know where you are. But there's also situations, and I've had some where I've wanted to not contest it. I'd rather it be in the local UAE court system. It is probably the best example because it is quicker, cheaper, it's low value. Yes, the contract had an arbitration provision because it's part of a wider suite of contracts. Invariably, I mainly deal with infrastructure type projects, so kind of we're either the main contractor or we're somewhere down that food chain, and if we're down the food chain, we get the contract provisions get kind of passed on a back-to-back basis. So the arbitration provision was right for the main contract, but it wasn't right when you get 5 or 6 levels down, but for whatever reason, it wasn't negotiated out. So I would happily try going to the local court and hope that nobody contests it. I've got a situation in Bahrain where I'm in fact trying to litigate under the Bahrainian court system, even though there's an arbitration provision, and I'm running the argument on the basis that the person who signed the contract and the arbitration clause didn't have a POA and was outside of his power when he signed the contract. So I'm in fact arguing my own default to avoid an arbitration clause. And the only problem I'd say with that is with any of these kind of jurisdictions, and I mean no disrespect to Nigeria, but I think it's kind of on a par within the GCCs. You have no idea how it's going to play out. You can get all kinds you get all kinds of crazy decisions.
Yes.
And invariably you let it run the whole course up to the Court of Causation or the equivalent Supreme Court, whatever it is, and hope over those 2 appeal legs.
Yes, the point I'm making here is this. With this practice direction, even you, the party in whose, where both parties agree that in the event of a dispute, arbitration is an option that they should consider, you were sanctioned. You were sanctioned by the court for not availing yourself of that provision, irrespective of the fact that, you probably chose to ignore that provision to institute an action first. Merely showing up in court, you were sanctioned once the court's attention is drawn to the fact that you had an arbitral provision that you ought to have taken advantage of before coming to court. So now, the step the CJN is taking here is to make this part of the rules of the courts. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Okay, maybe, sorry,
Yes.
just my final comment. As I understand it, in Nigeria, well, certainly in the GCC, I'm aware of the Lagos situation, but I haven't lived it. It's a situation that you either contest it at your first hearing, so you just say the court has no jurisdiction on here, and I've successfully done that in Lebanon, in Dubai, and everywhere else. This is an arbitration provision, and the courts will strike it out. And invariably, the judge will not be very best pleased because there's still a feeling in a lot of developing jurisdictions that they want to keep hold of the power to decide things. So
That's what this
they
present
don't-
direction seeks to stop.
there's a natural aversion for the judiciary to allow it to happen. So when you contest it, they don't necessarily want to let go, but they know they have to let go, and they look quite badly on the person who's brought the case without kind of looking at it, saying, well, you've chose arbitration, why are you wasting my time? But then you don't get costs and everything else, as we
Thank
talked
you
about earlier.
very much, Mark, and I think we have triggered a lot of discussion, beautiful discussion on this matter. So there are another set of presenters, but before we move on to the next topic,
I would like to ask our moderator to
Yes.
present the memento to our speaker.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm very much aware of our time schedule. That's why I stood up, and we would like to thank our singular speaker, Mark Kelly, who's given his time and knowledge to share with us arbitration. This is a very small memento for what you have shared this morning. Thank you very much, Mark.